She's pregnant, exhausted, and just trying to sit down on a plane. But when the flight attendant kicks her off, it's just the beginning. What happens next turns the entire situation upside down, because her husband isn't who anyone thought he was. And when the truth comes out, everything changes. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just another ordinary afternoon at the airport. The flight from Boston to Los Angeles was scheduled to board in less than an hour, and passengers were beginning to settle into their seats. Among them was a woman in her late 20s, visibly pregnant, who was already feeling the strain of her long journey. She had a bit of trouble finding her seat, and when she finally did, she was unsure if it was the right one. A flight attendant, who had been keeping an eye on her, immediately approached offering to help, but the interaction didn't go as smoothly as one would expect. The flight attendant, a woman in her early 30s, was already stressed herself. The flight was running late, and she had a long list of things to get done before takeoff. She glanced at the seating chart quickly and assumed the woman had mistakenly taken the wrong seat. Without much patience, she asked her to get up. The pregnant woman, exhausted and uncomfortable, tried to explain that she had the right seat, but was just feeling a little overwhelmed. But the flight attendant wasn't hearing any of it. "You need to move. This seat isn't yours," the attendant said, her tone sharp. The woman holding her stomach tried to show the ticket, but her hands were trembling. The confusion only made things worse. The passengers around them started to notice the tension, but no one stepped in to help. The flight attendant, frustrated, insisted again that she get off the plane. "If you don't move, I'll have to ask you to leave," she said, her voice growing louder. The pregnant woman stood up slowly, her face flushed with embarrassment. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had been on many flights before, and never once had anyone treated her this way. She tried to speak, but her words were lost in the rising chaos. Her thoughts raced as she wondered how she would manage to get off the plane, especially being pregnant and alone. The flight attendant's attitude had only added to her stress. The murmurs from the surrounding passengers grew louder, but still no one intervened. "Please, I just want to sit down. I need to rest," the pregnant woman pleaded, her voice shaky. But the flight attendant was adamant, her patience wearing thin. "I don't have time for this," she snapped. As the tension in the cabin thickened, the flight attendant made a decision that would soon spiral beyond her control. She took a step back, her face hardening as she looked at the woman once more. "If you don't leave the plane now, I'll have to call security," she warned. The pregnant woman, already teetering on the edge of panic, felt her heart race. She knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This was becoming a real problem. The passengers around them were starting to murmur, their discomfort evident. A few of them shot disapproving glances at the flight attendant, but none of them stood up to help. The pregnant woman was left standing, her hands clutching her swollen belly, unsure of what to do next. She felt humiliated, vulnerable, and utterly alone in a sea of indifferent faces. "Why is this happening?" she whispered under her breath. She couldn't fathom why the situation had escalated so quickly. All she wanted was to get comfortable for the flight and relax. But now, she was being forced into a confrontation she never asked for. Just as the flight attendant was about to call for security, the door to the cabin opened, and a man in a well-tailored suit walked in. His sharp eyes scanned the room briefly before landing on the pregnant woman. He didn't hesitate. He made a beeline for her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. He was tall, in his late 30s, with the kind of presence that made heads turn. "Is there a problem here?" His question seemed to catch everyone off guard, especially the flight attendant. She looked at him, confused, but before she could respond, the man turned to the pregnant woman and smiled. "Everything okay?" he asked softly. The flight attendant, still flustered, opened her mouth to speak but was quickly interrupted. "This is my wife," the man added, his words carrying a weight that immediately shifted the atmosphere. The flight attendant blinked, clearly taken aback. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The pregnant woman, who had been too stunned to say anything up until that point, finally looked up at him, relief flooding her face. I don't know what's going on. They're asking me to leave, she explained, her voice barely audible. The man turned back to the flight attendant, his expression cold. "You've just told my wife to leave the plane?" he asked, his tone firm but controlled. There was no anger, but there was something unmistakable in his eyes, a sense of authority that made the flight attendant feel small. The flight attendant, now visibly nervous, shifted on her feet. She opened her mouth to explain, but the words didn't come. She knew she had made a serious mistake, and this man's calm but unwavering stare only made it more obvious. She glanced around the cabin as if hoping for some support from the other passengers, but no one offered any. The murmurs had stopped. Everyone was watching now. "I'm sorry, but there's been some confusion," the flight attendant finally stammered. "I thought she was in the wrong seat and—" The man interrupted her. "She's pregnant, and she's not in the wrong seat." His voice wasn't loud, but it was authoritative enough to silence the room. The tension in the air felt like it could be cut with a knife. He turned his attention back to the woman. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone softening as he looked at his wife. She nodded, though her face was still pale from the stress. "Look, I was just trying to sit and rest," the pregnant woman said, now starting to regain some of her composure. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Her hands were shaking as she clutched her bag, but her voice was steadier now. The flight attendant, realizing that this was getting out of her control, took a step back. I'll have to check with the captain," she mumbled, almost as if she was trying to buy time. She didn't know how to handle this situation anymore. As the flight attendant hurried off to the front of the plane, the man turned to his wife. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked again, his face full of concern. The pregnant woman nodded but didn't speak right away. She felt embarrassed and vulnerable, still processing what had just happened. "I don't understand why she just jumped to conclusions like that," she muttered, more to herself than to her husband. Her husband, now visibly irritated, let out a quiet sigh. "It doesn't matter, we'll get this sorted out." His gaze shifted to the front of the plane, where the flight attendant was speaking with the captain. A few passengers, sensing the growing drama, had pulled out their phones, and the tension in the cabin was palpable. Minutes passed in an awkward silence. The flight attendant, now joined by the captain, returned to the aisle, and the captain looked directly at the man. "Sir, I apologize for the misunderstanding," the captain said, his voice surprisingly calm, though there was a clear hint of tension. "We just need to resolve this quickly. It seems we've had an error with the seating assignment." The man's expression was unreadable, but it was clear he wasn't interested in excuses. "I don't care about the seating. My wife stays on this flight." His words left no room for argument. The pregnant woman, now more confused than ever, looked back and forth between the two men, wondering if things would calm down or escalate further. And then, without warning, the captain did something unexpected. He turned to the flight attendant and asked, "Did you know who this passenger is?" His tone was not friendly. The question hung in the air, and the flight attendant's face turned pale as realization began to set in. The man standing beside the pregnant woman was not just some ordinary traveler. He was someone whose presence commanded respect. She had no idea who he was, but she was about to find out. The flight attendant's face turned a deep shade of red as the captain's words hit her. She looked at the man beside the pregnant woman, trying to make sense of what had just been said. She had been so focused on enforcing rules and managing her own stress that she hadn't even thought to consider who she was dealing with. Now, the uncomfortable reality hit her. She had no idea who this man was, or the consequences of her actions. The captain, still standing at the front of the plane, watched the flight attendant's reaction carefully. He cleared his throat, as if to underscore the severity of the situation. "This is Mr. Porter," he said quietly, though his voice still carried across the cabin. "The CEO of Porter Tech. The man who's revolutionized the tech industry in the last 5 years." He paused for a moment, allowing the name to sink in. The flight attendant froze, her mouth suddenly dry. She had heard of Porter Tech, of course. Everybody had. But never in a million years did she think she'd be standing in front of the CEO, unknowingly making his pregnant wife leave the plane. As the realization hit her, the flight attendant's face went pale. She stammered, I didn't know. I thought she was in the wrong seat. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Mr. Porter didn't let her finish. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. What you meant doesn't matter. You've embarrassed my wife, and you've made this situation far worse than it needed to be. The flight attendant opened her mouth to apologize again, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew there was nothing she could say to fix this. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. The pregnant woman, her face still flushed with embarrassment, finally spoke up. It's okay, really. I just want to sit down and get comfortable, she said softly, trying to ease the growing tension. But her husband wasn't having it. No, Mr. Porter said, his voice firm. This needs to be handled properly. You don't treat someone like this, especially not when they're pregnant. He turned his gaze back to the captain, his eyes narrowing. What are you going to do about it? The captain, clearly uncomfortable, glanced at the flight attendant. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again, he said. We'll upgrade your seats and make sure you're taken care of. But Mr. Porter wasn't finished. It's not just about upgrading seats, he said, his voice growing louder. It's about respect. You've shown none, and now you have to answer for it. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. She had seen plenty of angry passengers before, but this was different. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted entirely. People were starting to realize what was happening. This wasn't just a disagreement over seating. This was becoming a public spectacle. As the captain hurried off to make arrangements for the upgrade, the flight attendant stood frozen in place, her face a mix of regret and fear. The pregnant woman, still sitting in her original seat, tried to relax, but the weight of the situation hung heavily in the air. Mr. Porter took a moment to look at his wife, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange. He squeezed her hand reassuringly, but she could see that he was still visibly frustrated. It wasn't just about the seating, it was about the way she had been treated, disrespected and humiliated without any cause. He wasn't going to let that slide. Don't worry, he said quietly to her. We'll get this sorted. His tone softened, but his gaze remained steely as he looked at the flight attendant one last time. The captain returned a few minutes later, and the mood in the cabin had shifted. The tension was palpable, but the focus had now moved to resolving the mess that had been created. The flight attendant, still flustered, kept her head down, trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone. She was aware that she had just made a huge mistake, but the weight of her mistake was now becoming clear. Mr. Porter, the captain said, his voice much more careful now. We've arranged for you and your wife to be upgraded to first class. Your comfort is our priority, and I'll personally make sure everything goes smoothly from here. He looked at the flight attendant, his eyes telling her that the conversation wasn't over. She nodded quietly, avoiding his gaze. The flight attendant, now acutely aware of the power dynamics in play, couldn't bring herself to speak. Her apology felt meaningless at this point, and the public nature of the situation made her even more uncomfortable. Her mistake was no longer a small error. It had now become something that could cost her far more than a reprimand. Mr. Porter didn't respond immediately. He took a moment to process what had just been offered. Thank you, he said, his voice calm but lacking the warmth it had earlier. But I think this goes beyond just an upgrade. The captain nodded. Of course, sir. We'll take care of everything. As the captain arranged for the change, Mr. Porter's eyes never left the flight attendant. There was no anger in his gaze now, but there was something far more unsettling. Disappointment. And that was worse. Disappointment was something that stayed with you long after the anger had faded. The pregnant woman, still visibly shaken, looked at her husband. "You don't have to do all this," she said quietly. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes showed how much the whole situation had taken a toll on her. "I just want to get home." "I know," he replied softly, squeezing her hand. "But you shouldn't have to put up with being treated like that. Not by anyone, especially not on a flight where you're supposed to feel safe and comfortable." His words, though reassuring, couldn't erase the feeling of humiliation that had settled over her. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want anyone to know who her husband was. She just wanted peace. But the more she thought about it, the angrier she became at the way she had been treated. She was pregnant, and all she had wanted was a simple, quiet flight. Now, it felt like the world was watching, judging, and she was being dragged into something bigger than herself. As the captain walked off to finalize the seat change, the flight attendant stood still, her hands trembling slightly. She had no idea what would happen next. Would she keep her job? Would the company take action against her? The thought of the consequences made her stomach turn. The passengers, who had been whispering among themselves, grew silent as they watched the interaction unfold. Some had recorded the entire exchange on their phones, and now their quiet glances toward the flight attendant made it clear that this would not be something easily forgotten. The tension was far from over, and as Mr. Porter leaned in to speak to his wife, his words were simple but final. "Let's not waste any more time," he said. "We're getting out of here." The air was thick with an uncomfortable silence as Mr. Porter helped his wife stand up from her seat. The flight attendants, including the one who had caused the entire mess, stood awkwardly to the side, unsure of what to do next. It was as if everyone in the cabin was waiting for something. An apology, an explanation, or perhaps just for the moment to pass. Mr. Porter guided his wife toward the front of the plane where the captain was still trying to smooth things over with the crew. He walked with purpose, his every step steady and deliberate. A stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just moments ago. His wife, now slightly calmer, followed him, her hand gripping his tightly, as if to anchor herself in the midst of everything that had just happened. The flight attendants quickly cleared the way for them, though no one made eye contact. The tension that hung in the air was undeniable, and everyone in the cabin could feel it. The pregnant woman, still processing the embarrassment she'd just faced, glanced around. Some passengers were staring, others were busy with their phones, likely recording everything. She could hear hushed whispers. Some were sympathetic, others seemed more curious than concerned. As Mr. Porter and his wife reached the front, the captain approached them, offering his apologies once again. "I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience," he said, his voice polite but strained. "We've arranged for your new seats and everything will be taken care of from here on out." Mr. Porter didn't respond immediately. He looked at the captain, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to his wife and said quietly, "I don't think I've ever seen you so upset." His words were gentle, and though they were meant to reassure her, there was a sharp edge to his voice when he added, "And I don't think I've ever been more disappointed in how someone has treated you." His wife squeezed his hand, but her gaze was distant. "It's not your fault," she said softly, though her voice wavered. "I just don't understand why she would treat me like that." Mr. Porter's expression hardened. "It doesn't matter why. What matters is that you didn't deserve it. No one does. And I'm going to make sure it's known that this kind of behavior won't go unaddressed." The pregnant woman nodded, but deep down she didn't want any of this to escalate further. She just wanted to forget about the scene that had unfolded, to put it behind her and focus on the fact that they were heading to Los Angeles. But her husband wasn't about to let it go. He had a way of handling situations like this, quietly but with a kind of force that left no room for misunderstanding. Turning back to the captain, Mr. Porter's voice was now firm. "I want to make sure that the flight attendant responsible is dealt with. She made my wife feel worthless. No one should ever have to go through that, especially not while they're pregnant and traveling alone." The captain nodded, his face reddening slightly as he realized the full gravity of the situation. "I completely understand, sir. We'll take it from here. The issue will be addressed immediately." With a small nod, Mr. Porter turned to lead his wife toward their new seats. But just as they reached the first-class area, the flight attendant stepped forward. Her face was pale, and she looked like she wanted to apologize, but she didn't know where to start. Her hands trembled slightly as she met Mr. Porter's gaze. I really am sorry for what happened," she said, her voice shaky. "I didn't mean to cause any harm. It was a mistake, and I'll do anything I can to make it right." Mr. Porter didn't react at first. He simply stared at her, his eyes cold and calculating. He had no intention of forgiving her quickly, nor did he think she deserved it. But he didn't want to make a public spectacle of her either. "I'm sure it wasn't intentional," he said, his voice flat. "But the damage has been done, and now you need to understand that actions like this have consequences." The flight attendant nodded, though her face betrayed her growing anxiety. She was clearly not used to being confronted like this, and now she could feel the weight of the moment. Mr. Porter didn't say anything more, but his silence spoke volumes. He helped his wife settle into their new first-class seats, the flight attendants quickly stepping aside to give them space. For a brief moment, the pregnant woman closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She had hoped to escape the stress of her pregnancy with a peaceful flight, but it seemed that wasn't going to happen. What she hadn't expected, however, was the storm that had followed. And as the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fallout from this incident was just beginning. As the plane finally lifted off, the pregnant woman sat back in her seat, her mind still racing. The events of the last hour felt surreal, as if she had been caught in the middle of a nightmare. She had never imagined something as simple as boarding a flight would spiral into such chaos. The plane's engines hummed steadily, the noise almost calming, but the tension still lingered, thick and oppressive. Beside her, Mr. Porter sat in silence, his hand resting lightly on her arm. He hadn't spoken much since they sat down in first class, and she could tell that he was deep in thought. She could almost feel the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He was usually a reserved man, composed and in control, but something about this had struck a nerve with him, something he wasn't willing to just let go. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if she felt guilty for the trouble this had caused. Mr. Porter turned to her, his expression softening. "You didn't do anything wrong. You were just trying to sit down and relax. No one should treat you like that. No one." His voice was firm, but it held an undercurrent of concern. His protective instincts had kicked in the moment he saw her distressed, and they hadn't stopped since. She nodded, her eyes filling with a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. "I just wanted a peaceful flight. I didn't expect this." She trailed off, unsure of how to express what she was feeling. The humiliation, the confusion, the sudden shift in her world. It was all too much. Mr. Porter reached out and gently cupped her face in his hand. I know it's been a lot, but it's over now. We're in first class, and we're safe. You can rest." The pregnant woman managed a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The memory of the flight attendant's cold, dismissive attitude was still fresh in her mind. It wasn't just about the mistake. It was about the way she had been treated, like an inconvenience, like she didn't matter. That kind of disregard was hard to shake off. The flight attendants who had been working the cabin continued to glance nervously in their direction. They were doing their best to go about their duties, but every time they walked past, they shot quick, uneasy glances at Mr. Porter, as if they were waiting for some kind of judgment from him. It wasn't lost on her how the dynamics had shifted in the cabin. Before, she had been just another passenger, but now she was something entirely different. The quiet, subdued atmosphere around her was now full of tension, as if everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She shifted in her seat, adjusting the blanket that had been placed over her. The first-class service was top-notch, and for the first time since she had boarded, she allowed herself to feel a small sense of comfort. At least she wasn't being asked to leave anymore. But that comfort didn't last long. In her mind, the incident replayed over and over again. each time with more details, more moments she wished had gone differently. Mr. Porter, sensing her unease, reached into his bag and pulled out his phone. He didn't look at it immediately, but she knew what he was thinking. He was about to make a call, one that would likely escalate the situation even further. The idea of him making calls to executives at the airline, demanding answers, was enough to make her uncomfortable. But she couldn't blame him. After all, she had been the one who had been treated like a second-class passenger, not him. She was the one who had been humiliated. "Please don't make a big deal out of this," she said quietly, looking at him. "I just want to get to Los Angeles without any more trouble." Mr. Porter met her gaze, his expression serious. "You've been treated poorly, and it needs to be addressed. You deserve to be treated with respect. If I don't do something now, they'll think they can get away with this." She sighed, knowing he was right, but also not wanting to add fuel to the fire. She wasn't comfortable being in the spotlight, and now it seemed like there was no escaping it. With the whole plane having witnessed the ordeal, she knew this wasn't something that would just be forgotten. The flight attendants' nervous glances were proof enough that they were aware of the mistake and its potential fallout. A moment later, Mr. Porter finally looked at his phone, reading through the messages that had come in during the flight. There were several emails and texts from his business contacts, but one stood out. It was from a senior executive at the airline, an apology of sorts, but it wasn't enough. The words seemed empty to him, too generic. They didn't acknowledge the deeper issue, how his wife had been treated like a problem to be dealt with rather than a paying passenger. He typed out a quick response. "I expect a call from your CEO as soon as we land. This situation isn't something that can be swept under the rug." The pregnant woman watched him, a mixture of admiration and concern in her gaze. She understood why he was doing this, but she couldn't help but feel a little guilty. She didn't want to make a spectacle of it all, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure no one else would have to go through what she had. As they continued the flight, the air seemed to grow heavier. It wasn't just the weight of the moment, it was the weight of what was to come. There was no turning back now. The incident was going to spark a chain of events that neither of them could have predicted. And as the plane soared through the sky, they both knew that this wasn't just about a bad experience on a flight. This was about something bigger, something that would change everything. The remainder of the flight felt like it passed in a blur. The pregnant woman, her eyes occasionally flicking over to her husband, tried to settle into the comfort of the first-class seat. But she couldn't shake the feeling that everything around her was shifting, moving in a direction she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to follow. She had come on this flight to escape the grind, to relax before facing the final weeks of her pregnancy, but instead, she was tangled in a mess she hadn't asked for, and the more she thought about it, the less she wanted any part of it. Her husband, on the other hand, seemed more resolute with every passing minute. He had sent off a few more emails, made a couple of calls, and although his demeanor remained calm, she could feel the undercurrent of determination that was building within him. She knew he was serious about making sure the flight attendants, and the airline, understood the weight of what had happened. But despite his intentions to fix the situation, the pregnant woman couldn't help but feel a bit of dread. The fallout was inevitable, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. She leaned back, glancing out of the window, watching the clouds below. The sight was calming, but her mind was far from at ease. She thought back to the moment when the flight attendant had insisted she leave, her words cutting through the air. It wasn't just the misunderstanding over the seat that had stung. It was the way she had been treated as if she were a nuisance, a burden. That sense of being disregarded, dehumanized, had stayed with her throughout the flight, weighing on her chest like a heavy stone. "You okay?" her husband asked, pulling her out of her thoughts. His voice was steady, but she could hear the concern beneath it. She nodded, though she wasn't sure it was entirely true. "I'm fine," she said, but the words felt empty, hollow. She wasn't fine. How could she be? The embarrassment of the whole situation had seeped into every part of her mind, and no matter how comfortable the seat, No matter how much better she felt now that she was out of that cramped middle seat, she couldn't get rid of the knot in her stomach. He could see it in her face. "I know you're not," he replied gently, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to pretend. I'll handle this." She could see how determined he was, how deeply the injustice of what had happened to her had upset him. It was one of the things she admired about him, his quiet strength and the way he always stood up for those he cared about. But this time, it felt like his fight wasn't just about him. He was fighting for her, and as much as she appreciated it, she couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She didn't want him to make waves for her sake. She didn't want to be the reason he was at odds with an entire airline. "You don't have to go this far," she said softly. "It's just a mistake, a misunderstanding. We're in first class now. Maybe we can just let it go." But he shook his head, his jaw set. "It's not just about a mistake, it's about how you were treated. And that's not something I'm going to just forget." His voice was firm, but there was an underlying tenderness in it, a hint of protectiveness that she couldn't ignore. "No one should have made you feel that way. You deserve respect, not to be humiliated over something as trivial as a seat assignment." His words hit her harder than she expected. She had wanted to let it go, wanted to find a way to put it behind her, but something in him made her pause. She didn't want to make a spectacle out of something so small in the grand scheme of things, but his words reminded her of the bigger picture. What had happened wasn't about a simple mistake. It was about a lack of respect, an assumption that she was insignificant enough to dismiss. That was the part that hurt the most. "I know," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "But I didn't want all of this attention. I didn't want to cause trouble." "You didn't cause the trouble," he replied, his tone softening as he placed a hand over hers. "The trouble was caused by someone else's actions. You didn't ask for any of this." She leaned back into her seat, finally allowing herself to relax a little, but her mind was still spinning. She could feel the eyes of the flight attendants, still lingering on her from time to time, though now their glances were cautious, almost apologetic. The shift in the room was impossible to ignore. Before, they had been focused on their tasks, indifferent to the passengers' concerns. Now, there was an undercurrent of fear in the air, a sense that everything they did was being watched through a new lens. The pregnant woman couldn't help but feel a little satisfaction from that. The flight attendants were on edge now, and maybe they should be. They had witnessed a moment where their behavior had crossed a line, and they knew it. What had started as a small misunderstanding had spiraled into something bigger, something that would likely follow them both long after they reached their destination. As the flight neared its final descent, Mr. Porter took one last look at his phone, his jaw tightening as he read through a few more messages. The airline had already reached out again, offering their apologies in the form of a company-wide statement that had been shared with him. They acknowledged their mistake, but it wasn't enough for him, not by a long shot. He typed quickly, his fingers moving over the keys with purpose. "I expect a personal call from your CEO once we land. I'll be waiting at the gate." His wife glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "Not until it's handled," he said firmly. "This is bigger than just us. I don't want anyone else to go through what you did." She took a deep breath, knowing he wouldn't back down, and this fight, however uncomfortable it was, wasn't over. The rest of the flight was quiet, with only the hum of the engines filling the air. But as the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign blinked off, both of them knew that the moment they stepped off the plane, their story wouldn't just fade into the background. The consequences of what had happened were only beginning to unfold. The plane landed with a soft thud, the wheels touching down on the runway. It was a smooth landing, but for the pregnant woman every moment felt heavier than the last. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, she glanced out of the window, watching the city of Los Angeles slowly come into view. A new chapter of her life awaited, but right now all she could think about was the storm that had brewed mid-flight. The events of the last few hours hadn't just disrupted her journey. They had shaken something much deeper. Her husband, still absorbed in his phone, typed out a few more messages as the plane slowed. He had become almost mechanical in his response to the situation, firing off texts to his lawyer, business associates, and more pointedly, a few high-ranking executives at the airline. He wasn't just going to let this go. The sense of injustice he felt wasn't something he could brush off, and it wasn't just about him. It was about how his wife had been treated. He knew he had to hold them accountable, and he was going to do it no matter how much time and energy it took. "Are you okay?" he asked, finally looking up from his phone, sensing her unease. She turned to him, offering a weak smile. "I don't know if I'll ever be okay after all this." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, but they were true. "It's just so much. It feels like it's not even about the flight anymore. It's everything, the way she spoke to me, the way I was dismissed." Mr. Porter nodded, his expression darkening as he put the phone down. "It's not about the flight anymore, you're right. It's about something bigger, about how people think they can treat others. You don't deserve to be spoken to like that, no one does." She let out a breath, the weight of his words settling in. For a brief moment, she didn't know whether to feel relieved or overwhelmed. She had always preferred to avoid confrontation, to let small problems slide. But this wasn't a small problem. This was about her dignity, her rights as a paying customer, and the lack of respect shown to her simply because she was pregnant. "I appreciate everything you're doing, but I don't want you to make a spectacle of it," she said quietly. "I don't want to be in the headlines, or have anyone think we're just making this a drama." Mr. Porter leaned in, his voice quiet but resolute. "It's not about making drama, it's about making sure it doesn't happen again. And if I have to take this all the way to the top, I will. This isn't just about what happened on this plane. It's about what could happen to the next person who's treated like that. I can't let that slide." She looked at him, her chest tightening. He was right, of course. He wasn't doing this for the attention. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. But still, the thought of this turning into something bigger, something more public, made her uneasy. She wasn't the type to want attention drawn to her, especially not for something that had left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. The plane finally came to a stop at the gate, and the seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers began to gather their belongings, the bustle of the cabin increasing as people prepared to disembark. The pregnant woman felt the weight of the moment hanging in the air as she stood up, her husband beside her. They moved toward the aisle, and as they passed the flight attendants, she could feel their eyes following them. The flight attendants, though no longer openly hostile, were still tense, clearly aware of the storm they had helped create. They didn't make eye contact with her as she walked past, but she noticed the subtle shift in their demeanor. Once they reached the gate, Mr. Porter's phone buzzed again. It was another email from the airline's legal team, this time with an official apology and a request for a private meeting once they had landed. But he was done with emails. He was done with polite apologies. His wife had been humiliated, and he wasn't going to let the situation drag on for days while they fumbled through vague gestures of remorse. "Let's go meet them in person," he said to his wife, his voice steady. "I'll make sure they understand exactly what happened, and I'll make it clear that this isn't over until I'm satisfied with their response." She nodded, though part of her still wanted to let it go. The conversation wasn't going to be easy, and she wasn't sure she had the emotional energy for it. But she knew her husband. He wasn't someone who would back down, not when he believed in something so strongly. As they moved through the airport toward the meeting point, the pregnant woman found herself watching the people around them more carefully. A part of her felt exposed, as though everyone could see what had happened, even though no one could. The whispers, the occasional stares, the hushed conversations. It all felt like it was happening just outside her bubble of awareness, yet it still permeated her thoughts. People around her were unaware of the details, but somehow she felt like everyone knew what had transpired. The scene, the confrontation, it all had a life of its own now. They reached a small conference room at the airline's office where two executives were waiting. The room was sterile, professional, with clean white walls and an oversized conference table. As soon as they entered, the atmosphere felt different, more formal but also more charged. The executives rose to greet them, their faces strained, apologetic. Mr. Porter's wife, standing by his side, immediately felt a sense of discomfort. It wasn't just the fact that the apology seemed scripted. It was the realization that this wasn't a personal conversation anymore. This was now part of something much bigger. The moment the door closed behind them, she knew there was no going back. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, a cold silence filled the room. The pregnant woman stood with her husband, both of them facing the two airline executives sitting at the table. The executives, a middle-aged man and a woman in her early 40s, looked anything but confident. They were trying to maintain a professional composure, but there was no hiding the unease in their eyes. This wasn't just another customer complaint. It was a situation that had already spiraled out of control, and they knew it. The room was stark and uninviting, with nothing more than a glass of water and a few notepads on the table. The executives offered empty smiles as they gestured for the couple to sit. But neither Mr. Porter nor his wife moved. They weren't here for pleasantries. They were here to ensure that what had happened would not be forgotten. Mr. Porter took a deep breath, his posture straight and commanding. He could feel the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. This was no longer just about an inconvenience or an error. This was about accountability, about making sure no one else would be made to feel like his wife had. His wife, who had been humiliated by a flight attendant simply doing her job, or so she thought. No, this was bigger than that. This was about respect, dignity, and fairness. It was about power, too. And it was clear to Mr. Porter that the airline hadn't quite understood the gravity of what had happened until now. The executives exchanged glances, and then the man, the one who appeared to be the more senior of the two, cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. Mr. Porter, Mrs. Porter, first of all, I'd like to express our sincerest apologies for the incident on your flight today. This was, without question, a mistake on our part, and we deeply regret the distress it caused. His tone was measured but clearly strained, as if he was reading from a script but trying to make it sound genuine. But to the pregnant woman, it didn't sound genuine at all. The words felt rehearsed, as though they had been practiced in front of a mirror. The apology sounded like something the airline had prepared in case something like this happened, not something that came from a place of real understanding or remorse. Mr. Porter didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the executives as he responded. This wasn't a mistake. This was an attitude problem, a disregard for my wife's dignity, and if it had been handled properly from the start, we wouldn't be here now. His voice was steady, but there was an undeniable edge to it. The pregnant woman could feel the tension in his words, a tension that made the room feel smaller with each passing second. He was done with polite corporate apologies. He was done with empty words. Now it was about action. The female executive, who had remained silent until now, shifted in her chair and glanced nervously at her colleague. We understand that, Mr. Porter, and we take full responsibility. The flight attendant involved has already been spoken to, and we are conducting an internal review to ensure this doesn't happen again. But it wasn't enough. It was just another generic response. The pregnant woman could feel her husband's frustration growing beside her. He wasn't looking for promises of reviews or future improvements. He wanted tangible action. He wanted accountability, and he wanted to know that what had happened to her, what had happened to his wife, wasn't going to be brushed under the rug. And what exactly does that mean? Mr. Porter asked, his voice calm, but with an underlying tension. What kind of consequences are we talking about? Is a review going to fix what's already been done? Is a written apology going to make my wife forget the embarrassment, the humiliation she went through on that plane? Because I can tell you right now, it won't. The executives exchanged another glance. The male executive, clearly uncomfortable with the line of questioning, cleared his throat and leaned forward. Mr. Porter, please understand, we take customer satisfaction seriously. The flight attendant in question has been placed on leave, pending a full investigation. We will ensure this kind of behavior is not tolerated moving forward. Placed on leave? Mr. Porter repeated, his eyes narrowing. That's your solution? You take her off the schedule for a few days and that's supposed to make everything better? My wife is the one who was publicly embarrassed. My wife is the one who was made to feel like she was the problem. The pregnant woman felt a surge of frustration rising in her chest. She had wanted to stay out of the drama, but now, listening to the sterile corporate responses, she felt that familiar knot in her stomach again. She had been dismissed by an airline employee, yes, but this wasn't just about one person's mistake. This was about a systemic issue, the lack of respect and empathy for customers. It was about how easily someone could be cast aside because of something as simple as a mistake or misunderstanding. Mr. Porter, we assure you, the female executive said, her voice slightly shaking now. This will not go unaddressed. We are taking this very seriously. If you would prefer, we can arrange for a more private discussion with senior management at a later time, once the full investigation is complete. Mr. Porter shook his head. This isn't about private meetings. This is about making it right now. You think a private discussion is going to make my wife feel better about what happened on that plane? You need to take action. You need to show us that you're serious about this. You need to show everyone here that customers matter, that people matter, that pregnant women especially don't get treated like second-class passengers. The pregnant woman sat quietly, watching the exchange between her husband and the executives. She could see the frustration building in him, but she also saw something else. There was a quiet strength in his determination. He wasn't just advocating for her. He was advocating for every person who had ever been treated unfairly, who had ever been dismissed because of who they were or what they were going through. This wasn't just a fight for her. It was a fight for basic human dignity. The executives finally seemed to realize that this wasn't a conversation they could brush off. The female executive leaned forward, her eyes focused on Mr. Porter. We understand, sir, and we will take action. We'll reach out to you with a follow-up within the next 48 hours. In the meantime, if there's anything we can do to rectify the situation for you today, we are more than willing to assist. But the pregnant woman, feeling the weight of everything that had just been said, couldn't hold back anymore. I don't want your follow-up, she said, her voice cutting through the air. I don't want your promises. I want you to look at me and understand that what happened to me wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure in empathy, and you need to fix that now, not in a week, not after a review. Now. The room fell silent as the executives processed her words. The shift in the room was palpable. They could no longer hide behind corporate jargon or vague apologies. She had made it clear she wasn't backing down, and neither was her husband. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, the executives understood. They knew the battle wasn't just about one woman or one flight attendant. It was about making sure something like this never happened again. The tension in the room hung like a thick fog, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. The pregnant woman's words had cut through the polite corporate veneer, and for the first time since they'd entered, the two airline executives looked like they were grappling with the reality of what had happened. There was no escaping the fact that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was a deeper issue, one that went beyond a single flight attendant's actions. It was about an entire system, an entire mindset that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. The female executive, visibly shaken, sat back in her chair, her fingers nervously tapping on the table. The male executive, though still maintaining a professional demeanor, couldn't hide the anxiety creeping into his expression. He had assumed this meeting would be a quick, straightforward apology, an opportunity to smooth things over and send the Porters on their way. But now, it was clear to him that this wasn't going to be so simple. This was more than a quick fix. This was a reckoning. Look, Mr. Porter said, breaking the silence, his voice calm but firm. We're not here to bully you. We're not here to make threats. What we want is accountability. What we want is for my wife to feel like the person who wronged her actually has to face the consequences. His words were deliberate, each one landing with a quiet force. You talk about reviews and internal processes, but what does that mean for us right now? What does that mean for anyone who has ever been treated like this? The executives exchanged a glance, neither of them sure how to respond at first. But it was clear that the facade of corporate politeness wasn't going to be enough to move forward. Mr. Porter was asking for something more, something tangible, and they knew they had to provide it if they wanted to end this conversation on anything resembling good terms. The male executive cleared his throat again and adjusted his glasses. "You're right, Mr. Porter. The apology is just words. What we're offering, however, is a full, in-person investigation. A team of external consultants will review this incident, along with our training protocols for flight attendants, and we will implement stricter measures for customer treatment. We understand that for your wife, this wasn't just about a seating error. It was about her dignity, and we cannot allow our staff to treat passengers this way." Mr. Porter nodded, but his expression didn't soften. "That's a start, but it's not enough. The problem isn't just about staff training, it's about the culture you've allowed to grow. The flight attendant who made this mistake clearly thought it was okay to treat my wife this way. That's a problem that goes deeper than one person. That attitude needs to be eradicated, not just addressed." The pregnant woman, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke up again, her voice low but filled with a quiet intensity. "You say you'll investigate, but how long will that take? Will it be another round of corporate meetings, back and forth emails, and promises to do better? Because right now, none of that matters to me. I don't care about reports, I care about accountability. I want to know how you will make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Her words echoed in the room, leaving a palpable silence in their wake. The male executive opened his mouth, but for once he had no immediate answer. He was beginning to understand the enormity of what they were facing. This wasn't just about making a few apologies. It was about confronting a culture of indifference and entitlement that had allowed an employee to act out of line without fear of consequence. The female executive took a deep breath and spoke, her voice more measured now. "Mr. and Mrs. Porter, I hear you. And we're not just offering lip service here. We'll start by issuing a formal public apology. Not just a general statement, but one directed specifically at you and your experience. We'll make sure it's clear to our customers and employees that we do not tolerate this kind of behavior. We'll also take immediate action to suspend the flight attendant involved, pending a full review. And she will not return to her duties until we are certain she understands the severity of this situation. On top of that, we're prepared to offer you compensation for your inconvenience. We'll cover the cost of your flight and offer additional mileage and credits for future travel. But more importantly, we're committed to reforming our policies and ensuring that this doesn't happen again." The pregnant woman, who had been trying to remain composed throughout the meeting, felt a mix of emotions flooding through her. On one hand, she appreciated the effort to take responsibility, but on the other, the idea of compensation and gestures of goodwill felt hollow. None of that would change what had happened. The sting of humiliation was something that couldn't be erased by miles or credits. She looked at her husband, silently seeking his guidance, as if wondering whether this was enough. Mr. Porter was still processing the offer. He could see the genuine effort in the executive's eyes now, but he also knew that these were just first steps. There was still work to be done, work that would take time and sustained effort. He wasn't about to let them walk out of this room with the impression that it was over. "That's a step in the right direction," he said, his voice low but firm. "But let's be clear here. This is just the beginning. I'll be monitoring your progress on this. I want to see actual changes, not just promises. And I'm going to make sure your customers know that you're taking this seriously." The executives nodded, and for the first time their faces were a little less tense. They knew they were far from done, but the weight of the meeting had shifted. They weren't just dealing with a disgruntled customer, they were dealing with someone who was prepared to hold them accountable, no matter how high up the chain the issue went. The pregnant woman finally spoke again, her voice calmer now. "I just want you to understand, it wasn't just the incident. It was the feeling of being unseen. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter. And that's not something that goes away with a refund or an apology. I need to know that when I step onto a plane next time, I won't be treated like a problem." The room was silent for a moment, as the weight of her words sunk in. The male executive looked at her, his expression softening. "I understand, Mrs. Porter. We will do everything in our power to make sure you, and every other passenger, are treated with the respect they deserve." The pregnant woman nodded slowly, still unsure if she could trust their words. But there was something in their eyes now, something that told her they understood the seriousness of what was at stake. "Thank you," Mr. Porter said after a long pause, his voice quieter now, as if he knew the conversation was winding down. "I'll be in touch, and I expect you to follow through, every step of the way." As the meeting came to a close, the executive stood, clearly relieved that the confrontation had come to an end. Mr. and Mrs. Porter stood as well, and the pregnant woman finally allowed herself a deep breath, feeling the weight of the ordeal starting to lift. But as they walked out of the room and toward the exit of the airport, she knew this wasn't over. This had been a beginning, not an end. And as much as she wanted to put it all behind her, she also knew that she had just taken part in something far bigger than herself. Something that might, hopefully, make the airline industry a little more accountable, a little more human. But only time would tell if the change would stick. As they made their way through the airport terminal, the pregnant woman felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The confrontation had been difficult, draining, but also necessary. It was one of those rare moments when she realized how much power there was in speaking up, in demanding respect. Yet at the same time, there was an unease that lingered in the back of her mind. She knew the situation wasn't resolved just because they'd had their meeting. The real change would come later, if it came at all. Her husband, walking beside her, seemed more at ease than he had been during the meeting. Though his jaw was still set with determination, there was a softness in his eyes now. The fire that had driven him throughout the ordeal seemed to have cooled, though it was clear he wasn't going to stop until he was certain the airline followed through on their promises. "I can't believe that just happened," she said softly, breaking the silence between them as they moved toward the exit. "I never thought I'd have to go through something like that." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of empathy and quiet pride. "You didn't deserve it. You shouldn't have had to, but I'm glad you stood your ground, not just for yourself but for anyone else who might have been in your shoes." She gave a faint smile, but it was tired, worn. "I never thought it would get this big. It was just supposed to be a flight. Just a quiet, normal flight, but now it feels like I'm carrying this weight, this whole thing with me. I can't seem to shake it." "I know." His tone softened and he reached out to gently hold her hand. "It's been a lot, and it's not over yet, but I'll be with you through all of it. Whatever comes next, we'll handle it together." She nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always known he would support her, but something about this situation, something about the way everything had unfolded, had made her realize just how much he was willing to fight for her. It wasn't just about this one incident. It was about the way he saw her, the way he saw everyone. He didn't just let things slide when they were wrong. He was relentless when it came to justice. And that trait of his had become even clearer in the last few hours. As they walked out into the crisp air of Los Angeles, the noise of the busy airport seemed to fade into the background. The adrenaline from the confrontation was wearing off, leaving an odd mix of exhaustion and apprehension. She was grateful that it was over, but a part of her couldn't help but wonder what the long-term effects would be. What would the aftermath of this look like? Would the airline follow through? Would their actions have any real impact on how passengers were treated moving forward? "I keep thinking about it," she said, glancing up at him, "about how they seem to listen. But will they really change? Will it just be more talk?" Her husband looked ahead, his jaw tightening ever so slightly as he considered her words. "Change doesn't happen overnight. You don't just fix a broken system with a few promises. But we've got their attention now. They know we're serious and we'll hold them to it. The real test will be in how they follow through." She squeezed his hand, a little more at peace with his answer, though the uncertainty still lingered. There was a small part of her that wished they could just forget the whole thing and move on. She wanted to put the experience behind her and focus on the excitement of their arrival in Los Angeles. But the thought of what might be happening behind the scenes, the investigation, the meetings, the real work, kept her mind occupied. As they continued walking toward the exit, a thought hit her. Do you think it'll get worse before it gets better? I mean, with everything we've stirred up, do you think they'll fight back in any way? Her husband glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. If they're smart, they'll take this as an opportunity to actually change things. If they try to brush it off, though, they'll have us to deal with. And they won't like that. His voice was light, but there was a knowing edge to it. I can't imagine how they'll handle this, she murmured, more to herself than to him. It feels like we're at the start of something bigger than just a bad experience on a plane. You're right, he said thoughtfully. It's not just about us anymore. It's about setting a precedent. It's about making sure something like this never happens again. Not just with this airline, but with every airline. It's about the bigger picture. She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. He was right. This wasn't just about the two of them anymore. It was about making a statement, about ensuring that other passengers wouldn't have to go through the same thing. It was about demanding that the airline industry acknowledge its failures and make real changes. They reached the taxi stand, and Mr. Porter held the door open for her, his hand resting on her shoulder as she climbed in. She settled into the seat, letting out a long breath. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, there was a quiet sense of resolve between them. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. As the cab pulled away from the airport and onto the busy streets of Los Angeles, the pregnant woman leaned back, her thoughts turning inward. She didn't know what the next steps would be, or how the airline would respond in the coming days. But she knew one thing. They had taken a stand. They had forced their voices to be heard, even when it felt uncomfortable, even when it felt like the world was against them. And no matter what happened next, they had already made a difference. The future was uncertain, but they would face it together. And for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. That change was possible, that their actions had the potential to ripple out and make a lasting impact, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, whose dignity had been ignored or brushed aside. As the city skyline stretched out before them, the pregnant woman realized something. This wasn't just about getting to Los Angeles. This was about standing up for what was right. And no matter how long it took, she and her husband would continue fighting until the change they'd sparked truly took root. By the time they reached their hotel in downtown Los Angeles, the chaos of the day had settled into a quiet kind of exhaustion. The pregnant woman sat back in the cab, her mind racing through everything that had transpired. Each word, each decision, each moment where she had stood up for herself. She couldn't shake the weight of it all, but there was a strange peace in knowing she had done what was right. They had fought not just for her, but for something much bigger than that. And no matter how this played out, she knew she wouldn't look at the world in quite the same way again. Mr. Porter, who had remained calm throughout, now appeared tired, but there was no sign of regret in his eyes. He was proud of what they'd done, proud of her for speaking up, for pushing them to confront the reality of the situation. But his mind, as always, was already thinking ahead. He wasn't going to let this go, not until the airline showed concrete, lasting change. He would hold them accountable, and if he had to, he would take the fight all the way to the top. As the cab pulled up to their hotel, he turned to her with a reassuring smile. We've done all we can for today. Now, let's just take a moment to breathe. You've earned it. She smiled back, but it was weary. I don't even know what breathe feels like anymore. You will, he said softly, reaching over and gently touching her hand. But not tonight. Tonight we take a break from all of this. Tomorrow we get back to business. But tonight, it's just us. She nodded, grateful for his words, even though she wasn't sure how much rest she'd actually get. But there was something about the way he said it, something about the calmness in his voice, that gave her a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things would work out the way they hoped. Maybe the airline would change. Maybe they would do what was right. The cab driver unloaded their luggage and they stepped out onto the sidewalk, the evening air cool and fresh, a sharp contrast to the tension they'd been carrying all day. As they entered the lobby of the hotel, she couldn't help but glance around, noticing the normalcy of the world moving on around them. People checked in, others made casual conversation, their lives continuing without knowing the storm that had just passed over her. For a moment, she almost wished she could step into that world, one where everything was easy and small problems stayed small. But she knew that wasn't the reality. The fight they'd started was bigger than themselves, and it was going to take time to see if it truly made a difference. Later, in the comfort of their room, Mr. Porter opened the curtains and looked out over the city skyline. He took in the view for a moment, deep in thought. The city stretched out before them, bright lights twinkling in the distance. But there was something more important on his mind. The call he was going to make as soon as they left the hotel. He wasn't done with the airline, and neither was she. Not yet. He had started this fight, and he wasn't about to let it go until they had their answer. But for now, they allowed themselves a brief respite. He turned to his wife, who had already settled onto the bed, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. "You've done well," he said quietly, sitting beside her. "You stood up for what was right. And no matter what happens from here on, that's something no one can take away from you." She turned her head, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were tired, but there was a quiet strength in them now, a strength that had come from standing firm in the face of adversity. "I couldn't have done it without you." He smiled, a simple but genuine smile. "And you didn't have to. We're a team, always." She smiled back, this time more genuinely, and for the first time all day she felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest loosen just a little. "Thanks for being here, for everything." He leaned in and kissed her forehead gently, his voice steady and reassuring. "You don't have to thank me. It's my job to be here, to have your back. Always." As they both leaned back against the pillows, the weight of the day began to sink in. The fight wasn't over. It wasn't going to be over for a long time. There would be more calls, more meetings, more questions to answer. But right now, in this moment, they had each other, and that was enough. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles, and more hurdles to clear. But whatever came their way, they knew they could face it together. The world had tried to break her down today, but she had stood tall, and with him by her side, she knew she could stand tall through whatever came next. As the city lights blinked below, the pregnant woman finally closed her eyes, allowing herself to relax, even if just for a moment. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. They weren't backing down. They had taken the first step, and that was all that mattered. The rest was just a matter of time. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories just like this.